John is a highly credentialed expert in the field of EMS education and the director of Eagle Emergency Education Consultants. His paramedicine career spans an impressive 48 years. During that time, he's presented at both regional and national EMS conferences. He's a nationally certified EMS educator, healthcare simulation educator, and simulation operation specialist. He holds a BA in business administration, healthcare management, and associates in science degrees in both paramedics and nursing. John was honored by the National Association of EMS Educators in 2009 with their Legends That Walk Among Us award. He's also a charter member and past president of NAEMSE and the Florida Association of EMS Educators. And then before we get started, just wanted to share a quick note about Laerdal's mission. We are committed to helping save 1 million more lives every year by 2030. That's a goal that continues to guide our work and everything we do. Through global training programs and impactful partnerships, we've already seen meaningful progress, including millions of bystanders trained and thousands of lives saved annually. If you'd like to learn more, you can visit the link that you see on the screen. Rio mentioned we will be handling Q&A at the end of the presentation. So as she mentioned, please drop questions in the chat and we will cover them at that time. So thank you again, John, for joining us today. I will now turn things over to you.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you to everybody who's logged on to listen. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, if you have questions, you can save them for the end, or you can drop them in the chat, and we'll try and answer as many of them as we can in the time frame we have. So first off, like every good educator, there are learning objectives to the presentation, and these are those learning objectives that we're going to be using today. Specifically, we want to talk about how to use simulation in leadership to develop leadership skills and the process and the benefits for that. So first off, as many of you know, the concept of becoming a leader in EMS in the past has kind of been the baptize in fire kind of method. Is congratulations, you know, you're a good paramedic, you're now a supervisor. And we've received almost no training. And to this day, there's still agencies who unfortunately do that and don't provide a ton of training, or any training for that matter, for their staff. We see things like comments being made as well, the best training will be on the job training, so you'll learn as you go. Or, you know, managers are talking to each other and they'll say, you know what, we're going to promote John and he'll either sink or swim, and we're sure he'll swim, so it's not a big deal. The other comment that I used to hear a lot is, no one taught me to be a leader. It's all about learning as you go. So that's not really the way we want to train our leaders. It's not really the way that leadership is developed. So one of the first things that I want to talk about is, why can simulation help? All right, you can use simulation to develop a progressive decision making. In other words, you can use it to apply operationally, logistically through scenarios. So it makes it a little bit easier to kind of look at a person as you're developing them as a leader. So how will they react in operational situations? How will they operate in logistical situations? The best process here is to create something that can be tested and measured. So when we create these simulation environments, we want to be able to test and measure not only the soft skills of being a leader, but we want to look at emotional regulation. How does the student, the employee for that matter, how do they regulate their emotion when they're making decisions? How do they regulate their emotions when they're participating in a discussion? For example, interviewing a potential new employee, or a disciplinary action, those types of things. We want to look at that as a big picture, and simulation scenarios allow us to do that, allow us to test that without actually creating any harmful effects. So what does it really do? Well, first off, it puts the learner in a role that they have to be a problem solver. We give them a scenario and they have to respond to the scenario with realistic processes. How would they handle it? They're not just going to verbalize it, they're going to actually do it. One of the nice things about the way these simulations work is, as you develop them and as you use actors and even simulated patients in some cases, you can develop these scenarios so that people react to the scenario. They're generally built around realistic, progressively complex work environments. One of the things I really like doing is the interview of new employees and the disciplinary action, the discussion of, you haven't been doing your paperwork or you're arriving late at work, those types of things, because they're real world. That's what leaders have to deal with. That's what shift supervisors and shift commanders have to deal with. That's what managers have to deal with. It's important that when we look at these scenarios and we start building these scenarios, that we think about the tasks that we want them to become experts in, and the concept of developing critical thinking skills. So these scenarios need to be designed in order to create that process. So why should we use simulation? Well, first off, it gives you the opportunity to look at the real-time consequences of the potential leader, or the leader for that matter, making decisions. How is their decision making in real time? One of the important things about developing these scenarios is creating time for the actors and the leader to interact so that you can see how they react to consequences of the things they say and consequences of what the actor might say. The nice part about this is it's done with no risk and no endangerment of personnel. All right, it's in a controlled environment. It can be stopped and restarted at any time. So you can practice high risk, low volume, and even unusual situations without having to worry about what are the results going to be. Is it going to cause peripheral issues? The other nice thing about simulation is you can pretty much use it in any environmental condition, and it can be done anytime. You can do it in an office, what the simulation is called in situ, in actual situations. So you can do it in an office, you can do it in a classroom. You can create the environment around the scenario so that when the leader or the student comes in to sit in and interact in the scenario, it's as real as possible. So, what are the opportunities? And so why would you want to do this? Why would you ask your training staff, your simulation staff, to spend some time developing these kind of scenarios? Well, first off, everyone who's ever participated in simulation will tell you how engaging and motivating the learning environment can be when it's performed properly. So it's very easy to put together. Most of the training staff these days in departments and almost all the educational staff at colleges have some experience with simulation and simulation development. It allows you not only to assess the individual, but also you can analyze teams, you can look at group dynamics. So scenarios can be developed not only around the leadership skills themselves, but around the process that follows leadership skills. It allows you to begin to look at your organization. How are our leaders? How are our shift commanders? How are our chief officers? How are they looking at situations? And are they critically dealing with those issues properly? You can do things like look at, is there bias within the organization, so that you can teach leaders to understand when they have an unknown bias and help to eliminate that bias. Can also go through some things. Gaming effect, has a little bit of volume here, but the way the scenario is designed can reduce that gaming effect. The nice thing about simulation, as I said, is you can start it, you can stop it, and it can be done fairly quickly. You can do multiple scenarios in a day, and you can allow the leader to kind of walk through that process. The other thing is it creates this kind of internal productive competition feeling with your staff. Supervisors and shift commanders, we all know they all want to be the best, and they all want to be better. Everybody knows the whole C shift is better thing. So this allows this friendly competition within the organization, within the organization's leadership skills. So, what's the return on investment? I mean, for directors and administrators and chiefs, the bottom line is, what's my return on investment? How much is this going to cost me? And, what do I get out of it? Well, first off, you can maximize your simulation time because you can do it in this controlled simulation environment. You're not having to send them off to classes, and you're not having to pay for travel and those types of things. It allows them to look at, as an organization, to look at the way leadership is managed and the way leadership does their job, and it gives them an opportunity to fine-tune that. And as for the primary financial impact, as people say, well, what is this going to cost me? Okay, it's much cheaper, obviously, than sending them to specialty courses and with travel fees and overtime and backfill and that types of things. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't send people to those, because there are some really good ones out there, but this is a way to do everyday leadership training in your organization without it costing you a ton of money. So why? Well, first off, it's easier to use, it's more efficient, and it's a cost-effective way to get your people to understand how to react, how to deal with real-life situations. We all have had that opportunity if we've been the ones that were thrown into the job as a supervisor. That first time we have to talk to someone about the dreaded body odor discussion, or the pressed uniform, the wrinkled uniform discussion. Everybody at some time in their career as a leader has had to have that discussion at least once. Those are very awkward, and things like simulation allow you to develop a process to do that and make it less awkward. It helps you to react properly in the real life situations. So, simulation allows you to practice, and that's what we're talking about. It allows you to practice your actions. It allows you to practice responses, and it allows you to look at the effect of your responses on the situation. So with a good actor in a simulation, when the leader reacts to the situation, the actor has options, and usually that's a script of options that's been taught to the actor, and the actor can then move. The difference between this type of simulation and clinical simulation has a very set pattern, and we expect the clinician to move through that process in the protocols, for example, standing orders, that type of thing. Whereas in a leadership situation, there are various routes a leader can take in the process of talking to an employee, or in the process of operating in an interview process or a discipline process. With the actor, we can allow the actor to react to how the leader comes across. Therefore, we develop those skills, and we can obviously look at what's good, what's bad. Scenarios can be stopped and restarted so that we can do right there a spot-on training, spot-on education. The nice thing about it is this is generally a one-on-one situation. Things like shift commanders talking to people about coming in late, not doing their paperwork, not having their clinical reports in on time, personal issues, those types of things. These are one-on-one situations in the real world, and in this simulation, you can make them one-on-one. And you can do this by allowing the leadership candidate or the leader themselves, they can look at work in a wide range of areas. So if you develop these scenarios as real world as you can, based on things that you've experienced as a leader, that you've heard other leaders experience on, the basic things are always there. Getting your paperwork in on time, showing up on work on time, dressing properly, meeting standard of care, following protocols, following operational guidelines. Those are the standard situations that we know leaders deal with, but how do they deal with it? So giving them the opportunity to encounter those kind of situations, real world developed situations, allows them to develop that experience. So what's the process? So first off, the most important thing is that you need to develop a needs assessment. If you're looking at creating leadership simulations, where are the areas that you have issues in your organization? So do a needs assessment. You can survey your current leadership. You can survey your staff, for that matter. And what are the areas that they're uncomfortable with? What are the areas they feel work needs to be done on? I can tell you the first time I had to do the body odor discussion, I'd never had that discussion with anyone before. I think it was just as an emotional experience for me as it was for the employee. Thankfully, the employee was not offended, and we had a very good conversation. But then it doesn't always come out positive. So it gives the opportunity to look at how do we do that. So do a needs assessment. Select so many categories. One of my recommendations is don't go overboard. Select 2 or 3 categories to start with. Do the simulations on those, and then move down your list, this list that you've created. Look at what is your core leadership in education in your department. If you have a leadership program, whether that's a leadership program that's actually the department's, the EMS agency's leadership program, or whether it's a governmental program at the county, at the city, or whether you're using some type of leadership program from an educational organization, or you're hiring a private firm to come in and do leadership education. How does what you want to do with this simulation, how is it going to integrate into that core education that you're creating for leadership development? The other thing is avoid focusing on the process of simulation, focus on the outcomes. When these scenarios are created, they don't require a lot of mapping out like clinical simulations do. The idea is to get the two representatives, the actor or actors, if you're doing it multiple, and the student, the leader, to interact. So we want that process to interact. So we don't want to look at focusing on what comes next. We want to look at what outcomes do we want, and then having that process of the actor reacting with the leader develop and look at how those outcomes will come. Simulations can be developed as clinical ones can be developed as group activities. Many agencies, when they develop these and do these, they have an observation process where one of the leaders in the core education process is performing the simulation, and others are able to watch it. Maybe not while it's running, maybe it's videotaped and then they run it later in the classroom. One of the things I've discovered is peers are much more provide much more pressure on each other than we as educators do. So providing that opportunity for peer interaction can really move the activity forward. The other thing is it's really important that once you start developing simulations, that you do not just develop those simulations and use them forever. It's really important that you assess how the process works. Are we doing pre-briefings? Are we doing debriefings? Are they working? Do we need to change the way we do a pre-briefing or a debriefing? You know, we want to come in and make sure we're doing these pre-briefings where we are pre-briefing the actors, but also the participants, at least giving them a concept of what they're can expect. But that debriefing process at the end of the simulation, really important, because that's where the majority of the learning process comes in that debriefing, where now we're discussing how the leader reacted in the situation and where things could go, where they should go, and then that thin line in between what HR will accept and what HR will not accept. Okay, so it's important to look at how are these simulations designed? How are they being used? Are they working? And remember that, you know, the world changes pretty much daily. So simulations, once they're designed, they're not finished. You're constantly relooking at those simulations. Are they working? How can I fine tune them? How can I make it better? So, you know, people wonder, you know, how is simulation limited? And really, it can be, depending on how you design the situation, but its effectiveness is only limited by how complex and how real world you make the simulation scenario. All right. One of the things that I'm adamant about telling simulation educators, especially new ones, is try not to go overboard with the simulations. I'm always telling my clinical educators that we don't want necessarily the Danger Will Robinson. I'm showing my age here, but the Danger Will Robinson scenarios. As I tell them, for that first clinical scenario, you don't want, the busload from a hemophiliac camp driving off an embankment and having 20 patients. That should not be the first simulation your EMT or your paramedic students see. They should be more basic to start with and then build to the larger programs, build to the larger scenarios. The key to leadership simulations is they have to be real world and they have to grow in complexity. Start out slow and simple and allow the scenario to develop in its complexity. They need to be grounded in real life situations. And I think now I've said this 10 times, and I'm going to keep saying it throughout the presentation. If you do not develop these scenarios like real world situations, real life things that have been experienced or could be experienced, they're not going to be of much value. And your learners are not really going to pick up on what they need to learn. the scenarios need to look at how leaders adapt and how they can adapt leadership styles. We all know that one leadership style isn't the way to go, whether you're using emotional intelligence, or whether you're using, human nature, or whatever concept of quote unquote leadership skills you are using, or leadership styles you are using. Those have to be adaptable. Not every employee reacts properly or the same with every leadership experience or every leadership style. So we have to teach our leaders to adapt to the situation and to adapt to who they're talking to. Okay. It's a little bit different situation if you have them reacting to someone within the department as with outside the department. Is that leader acting as your PIO today because your PIO is sick and they've never done that before? How do they react to the public? How do they react to that kind of questioning? The other thing is your scenarios, like your organization, need to continually evolve. It's important to understand that you can't just develop these scenarios, drop them in a computer program or a 3-ring binder on the shelf on the desk, pull it out when you need it, and think it's going to work. They need to constantly be reviewed. Things change. HR policies change. Just the general concepts of how leaders deal with their employees change. Not to mention the fact that as leaders change, and as you see leaders developing, those basic scenarios don't provide education and don't provide sharpness for their edge, for their leadership edge. And we want to constantly sharpen that leadership edge. So we need to continually look at, how are we doing these scenarios? Can we design them better? Can we develop them better? And as I said before, the post-debriefing, the post-simulation debriefing, very, very important. It's a formal review. Think of it as a hot wash lessons learned approach to the scenario. We're going to sit down not only with the student, the leader, but also with whoever else participated in this scenario, if there was an actor or more than one actor on this scenario. And we're going to have an in-depth review, a hot wash, if you will, of how the scenario went, good and bad. Now, my rule of thumb is I try to end these always on a positive note when possible, and generally you can do that. But it's really, really important to understand, do not skip the post debriefings. A lot of educators in the beginning, when we first started using simulation, especially on the clinical side, they talked to the students and then they kind of moved on, and they didn't do formal debriefings. Formal debriefings can double and in some cases triple the education flow to the team that is doing the scenario. It allows them to, now they've reacted, now it allows them to analyze their reactions themselves and the other people participating. And then also you as the person managing the simulation can have, that leadership quotient drop in of information. So the debriefing is very, very important. I want to backtrack just a little bit and talk about the pre-briefing for a second. The effectiveness of a simulation is going to really sit on how the scenario is designed. I'm a firm believer that you have to pre-brief not just your actors, but also the participants. The participants, if they've never participated in simulation, and certainly they probably have not participated in leadership simulations, need to know what is and what isn't going to work. Okay, so they need to kind of have an understanding of, this is what we expect it to run like. You're not going to give them an overview of the scenario itself and tell them what's going to go on, but we want you to react. Don't worry about the process around all of this. Work with the actor. React to the actor. React to the situation. React to the information you are given. And I tell them up front in the pre-briefing, don't try to dig deep and find an answer. React. Because when you react, positive or negative, when you react, you learn. Okay, and then we can use that reaction process in the post-simulation debriefing to hone that edge and improve the status. So, one of the things that I've been asked a lot is, okay, so I developed these scenarios. What am I going to use them for? Well, one of the biggest ones is communications. How well do leaders communicate with their teams? How do they communicate 360? How do they communicate to their team? How do they communicate to those above them? How do they communicate to the patient, to the situation around them? Maybe the politics of the situation, if that's a situation. But this concept of learning how to do active listening and two-way communications, leadership simulations are an extremely strong way to teach communication skills. It's also a strong way to evaluate communication skills and allow a leader to find where their, I hate to use the words weak spots, but they're slow spots that they can work on over time to improve. With communications comes the concept of team dynamics. All right. How do they react with their team? If they're a shift commander or they're a shift supervisor, how is their ability to react when they have a large meeting with staff, when they go into a station and they're dealing with a crew rather than one-on-one as an individual? So it allows the concept of building team dynamic skills in addition to this process of one-on-one. So now we've taken communication skills kind of to the next level and added the one-on-one communications. We've now added communications in a broader sense. Of course, with that comes interpersonal dynamics. Not everybody likes everybody they work with. So how do we handle those situations when we're uncomfortable with an employee or the employee is uncomfortable with us and now it's time for us to sit down with them one-on-one or a team for that matter? That interpersonal dynamics, when you look at the way teams, interpersonal dynamics and communications fold into each other, those are very hard to teach in a classroom setting, throwing PowerPoints up or lecturing. But you do it in a scenario, and in that post debriefing, the opportunity to explain how communications, interpersonal dynamics, and team dynamics flow with each other becomes more available. It also becomes more visible. Many times you'll see the light go on when you start to talk about communications and team dynamics and interpersonal dynamics in that post debriefing. The student, the leader, their lights pop on. Oh my God, I should have done, or I think, if I had it to do again, I would do this. And of course, the basic things of, we want these scenarios to teach them what are the roles and responsibilities of being a leader. Now, there are general roles and responsibilities of leadership, but there are organizational roles of leadership. What is the ethos of the organization? What are the ethics and moral uptake of the organization? How do we get our leaders into that process so that they're understanding how the organization's leadership roles and responsibilities flow up as well as down? And that's really important. They need to understand that all of this flows up and down. The people above them, people below them. Everybody has a boss. Even the chief has a boss. There's usually some board of directors or a city manager or a county manager or a public safety director or emergency services director over them, whatever that person is. Everybody has someone they report to. So this process allows us to go 360, if you will, all the way around. The other thing that organizational roles and responsibilities are important, but it gives simulations that you put together in your organization, give you the opportunity to test policies and procedures. How well do your leadership teams understand your policies? How well do they understand the procedures that you use, your HR procedures, your internal procedures, the policies that you have, why those policies even exist? I did a leadership simulation recently for an organization, and one of the policies was on dress code and uniforms. It was an organization that had heavy winters and the jackets they provided and that type of thing. And there was a lot of discourse amongst the organization, apparently, on that process and what jacket was appropriate and what was not. So one of the things that the chief of that organization wanted was all the supervisors on the same page. So we helped use simulation to move them into that policy and procedure process so they were all on the same page. So when they walked out of that training, they were all saying the same thing, and it was supporting policy. But the other thing that it allows you to explain those policies and procedures to these leadership candidates. So they're just not reading it on paper and thinking, okay, that's the policy, but why? You're in the post debriefing, you can give them the whys because they're going to ask questions. And it gives you the opportunity to explain policies, explain processes, all right, which they can then go back and do to their teams because we've taught them interpersonal dynamics, team dynamics, and we've taught them communications. The other thing that's kind of interesting, that's kind of developed as I started doing these, is the way leaders document their interactions with employees and with staff, with personnel, both up and down. A lot of organizations don't have a standardized documentation process. You fill out an incident report or you fill out a disciplinary report that maybe someone in HR designed that really doesn't go with the process. So it gives you an opportunity to develop documentation policies and procedures, if you will, and then teach those policies and procedures and see how well they document. Some of us are old enough to remember when we did this with pen and paper. It's much easier these days with computer to create these kinds of documentation processes and to have those available for the staff, but do they know how to use them? Simulations allow you to learn not only how they interact, but before you do the post briefing, how do they do the paperwork? How do they respond to the documentation process? Now, I will tell you that there are lots of alternatives in this process. These are just a few of the things that you can incorporate into leadership simulations. These are the ones that I target when I write simulations, and I invite my faculties to target these things. Why? Because communications in a leadership role, being able to communicate 360, up, down, sideways, really, really important. The clearer your communications, all right, the clearer your communications, the easier it is to explain roles and responsibilities, to explain policies and procedures, but also the clearer your team sees why you're asking them to do things the way you're asking them to do it. That enforces team dynamics. All right. The other thing that sometimes people use these leadership simulation processes for, and seen it work really well, is when you have teams that are not functioning well and you can't remove people from the team for whatever process. Creating leadership simulations that put the team in those situations so they have to interact helps them build interpersonal skills with each other. And that can become important when you're looking at how teams react interpersonally with each other as the members of the team, but also how they react to the supervisor, how they react to administration, and how they react to the public. And we all know public perception of an organization is what the organization is seen as. We can be the #1 clinical organization, but if we're rude and obnoxious, they say rude and obnoxious. That's their perception. That's what they see. So this concept of being able to teach communications, team dynamics, interpersonal dynamics, and weaving those into roles, responsibilities, and policies or procedures are one of the keen ways that you can look at simulation like this and say, what's the benefit of it? Now, remember that when you're designing these scenarios, it's got to be aligned with the strategic goals of your organization. Where do you want your organization's strategic goals to fit into the way your leaders manage their teams? Where does it fit into the way your leaders manage the organization as a whole? And then how does that organization strategic goals fit into the bigger picture, the politics of everything that's going on? Using simulation, you can design scenarios that give you an ability to apply and align your strategic goals into your leadership education. And that's an important concept. As we have said before, we've just kind of dropped people into leadership skills or leadership roles in the past and hope they sink or swim. We hope they swim. We hope they turned out to be great because they're a good medic, and we just assume they're going to make a good leader, or they're a good EMT, and we assume they're going to make a good leader. Or for that matter, moving them up the ladder, they're a good shift commander. How are they going to be as an ops chief? Or how are they going to be as a logistics chief? Or can I move them and put them into a problem area, and how will they deal with that problem area? Communications, with the warehouse, supply, clinical supplies, whatever that process might be. How can we use our strategic goals? How can we use the organizational goals to educate our leadership so they can move throughout the organization and understand those strategic goals, project those strategic goals for the organization, and apply those in the way they lead. Now, this whole concept of simulation really is about letting someone walk a mile in someone else's shoes, if you think about it. Okay, we want to put them in these situations and that we want to see how they react. They've never been in this situation. If you've never had to do the body hygiene discussion, that can be harrowing as the leader, as the supervisor, let alone the employee who's also, having to deal with this concept. It's important to understand that simulation allows you to let them walk a mile in your shoes or whoever's shoes you want them to walk in, to look at how these situations would be handled. So think about it as an opportunity for these leaders to slip on leadership skills without there being negative consequences. In a simulation, you can stop it at any time. You can rewind it. You can restart it. You can discuss it. You can't do that in the real world. When the mistake's made, the mistake is made. The best part about simulation is you can do it without creating any environmental damage, any organizational damage. All right. It also gives the leadership candidates the opportunity to better understand the organization. I can't tell you how many times I've been in a meeting and said, we're having a problem with such and such. It's in this section in the employee manual. It's in this section in standard operating procedures. And then my next question is, how many of you have actually read that? And I'm never surprised that no hands go up. I would be willing to bet that many of you on this call can think about when was the last time you actually read through your standard operating procedures, or whether you read through your administrative protocols, whether you sat down with HR and discussed discipline processes and how it was going to flow. Most organizations have really nice manuals. These days they're on the computers. We used to have them in the 3-ring binders with that collected dust behind us in our office. But very few actually review those, and even worse, very few update them. So the other benefit of simulation is as you're doing these simulations and you're looking at our policies, our procedures, how are our leaders working through this? How are the organizational goals being depicted? You can start to look at, that policy's 10 years old. That policy's 8 years old. Not sure it works anymore. Beard policies are a good example. Tattoo policies are a good example. Care length are a good example. Those types of things, those change over time. If the operating procedure for that is 5 or 6 years old, it may not be applicable now. So doing these simulations allows you to start looking at those and looking at how an organization's activities, how its leadership functions as an entity, as an overview of the organization, as opposed to operating in silos. Many of us old timers remember the concept when you had the A, B, and C shift in an organization, and the director would say, I feel like I have 3 organizations. I have organization A, organization B, and organization C, because you're all not on the same page. And it's a constant struggle to get those shift command personnel on the same page. And simulation is a way to help them develop the skills to understand why they need to be on the same page. So we kind of talked about why. How do we do it now? We talked about the importance of building realistic real-world simulations. So what I tell people is, what's going on in your organization? What have you seen? I mentioned a few here, being late, continually late. What's the reason for that? The hygiene issue, not wearing the proper uniforms, not responding to pages, not responding to emails, whatever that might be. There are standard things. But there are a lot of things that are organization specific, and you can develop realistic scenarios that are organization specific. Now, how do I develop a scenario? I'm 9.9% sure out of 10 that your education staff, if they're using clinical simulations, they have some sort of template that they're using. If they do not, the Society for Simulation in Healthcare has an excellent template on their website, and it's free. You can simply download it. But the template is a basic design of how to develop a scenario. So you can use these templates to develop the format for the scenario so that you have the pre-briefing, the actual scenario, and the debriefing and how those work. But I'm going to emphasize, and I've said it, like I said, probably now 14 or 15 times, real world simulations. It has to be stuff that's real world. You're not going to have some of these, major things. Things like devastating things like an employee having alcohol in their breath, or if you have a firearms policy, maybe the employee's violating the firearms policy, or a policy of who can be in the station at what time of day. One of the agencies that I worked with, after 5 o'clock, no one was allowed to visit the station, and no family was allowed in the station after 5 o'clock. I never really understood what that policy was for, but that was the policy, and it needed to be enforced, so it needed to be explained. So those are the kind of things, real-world simulations that incorporate and emphasize leadership skills, your operating procedures, your rules and regulations, and again, do not neglect your HR policies. That many of your field medics have no idea about those policies unless they, for some reason, have interacted with HR, whether that's a disciplinary action or a request for assistance. They may not know the HR side of this. So it's a good way to get your leadership personnel or your incoming leadership personnel to understand HR. The other thing is when you develop these scenarios, one of the things that can really make or break a scenario is how well does it work? First of all, will it flow? Is it cost efficient? So what I constantly push is you have to pilot test scenarios when you develop them. So what does that mean? That means that you take a group that you feel is already skilled at what you're going to be testing, and you run them through the simulation. That could be FTOs or shift supervisors. That could be experienced paramedicine faculty from the university that is helping you. Excuse me. It could be your high-end, high-experienced EMS personnel that you eventually want to move into the supervisor role. I'm really one of those faculty members, one of those people who looks at how are my former students doing and are they moving up? And do I have high performer former students that are in other organizations that I might be able to help pull in to test these pilot tests for me? If you've got leaders in your organization that everybody considers a good leader and you consider a good leader, ask them to step in and take the scenario and flow with it. They can give you insight on how to clean the scenario, how to sharpen the edges of that scenario, and how to make it more agency specific. And that's really, really important. And every time you upgrade the scenario, so you've changed it for whatever reason, HR policies have changed, whatever, retest it, repilot test it. Now, do you have to pilot test it 20 times? No. Usually what I do is twice, at least 2 different groups tested. We take their data, their information, and we look at what edges do we need to soften, what edges do we need to sharpen. Now, it's really important that if your agency has a standardized simulation process that they use in their clinical simulations, you should try and use that validation process, that clinical process, in the leadership simulations as well. Generally, they flow pretty good, and it will give you the opportunity to be able to use a standardized approach across education in your organization. One of the last things that's really important from the perspective of the person who is the leader who's going to be in this class, or maybe it's your staff and you're doing general leadership training and you're going to include these scenarios. Pre-readings are important. All right. If they don't understand the policies and procedures, and they don't understand the operating protocols, and they don't understand that the ethics and the morality of the organization, and they don't understand the ethos of leadership within the organization, scenarios are not going to work. So it's important to kind of give them some pre-education to this simulation, whether that's reading, whether that's sit-down conversations at the station going over protocols or standard operating procedures. You have to learn to develop those, but it's really important. You don't just drop people, especially if you're opening this training up to anyone in the organization who might potentially someday want to be a leader, which I highly recommend you do that. You need to make sure that they're pre-educated, that they understand what that process is going to be, understand about the operating procedures, understand about how HR fits into this, how policies fit into this, how standard guidelines of leadership within your organization, how those flow. Now, you know that this is not anything new that I'm going to telling you, but you know that pre-hospital care is constantly changing. And because it is constantly changing, our education process is constantly changing. So it must be the same with simulation. As I have said, you cannot design these scenarios and just leave them on a shelf and use them whenever you want. Test them, use them, retest them. So, maybe you need to soften it. Maybe you need to sharpen it. Maybe you need to change the concept was good, but the scenario itself wasn't working. It wasn't getting where you wanted to go in the process. So constantly update them. All right. I tell my simulation faculty all the time, once you write a scenario, you have it for life. You need to play with it constantly. You need to constantly look at it. Does it work? It's never truly finished because you're constantly changing it to the environment, to the students, and to the world and how the world fits. What's, on the clinical side, it's scope of practice changes, constant scope of practice changes. I mean, think in the last 6 months to a year, the things you've seen in the clinical settings, blood products, field ultrasound, all the new pharmaceuticals that are out there. We're constantly changing our clinical protocols. Therefore, we're changing our clinical simulations. Same situation here. And remember that if you make major changes, pilot tested, revalidated. Really, really important. If you do not pilot test and do not validate, the changes don't make a lot of sense. Okay, so kind of coming to the conclusion here, just an idea. These are some of the research that has been made about how simulation technology and how simulation-based education functions. A couple of things. Simulation has proven to improve leadership knowledge and skills, but more importantly, it allows them to practice in a controlled and safe environment. And that's really important, controlled and safe environment. Okay. It allows you to do deliberate practice while promoting acquired skills and supporting retention for employees. The more we educate our employees, the more we show them they're valued, the more likely they are to stay with an organization. We all know recruitment and retention these days is way high on our list of things we need to deal with. So it's important to understand how do we maintain employees? How do we get them happy with the organization? How do we get them happy with the process? We barely have career ladders in paramedicine. We know that. And when we have them, we need to be able to get employees prepped and ready to move up those ladders, and simulation can help you do that. This is the bibliography. These are many of the concepts that we've been talking about have been based on this research and these articles. You're more than welcome to take a screenshot of this. My emails addresses will be at the end of the presentation here. If you have a question, please don't hesitate. Drop me an email. Say, hey, John, I was in the webinar. I started thinking about this and I need an answer, or I need help, or where can I find this? I'm happy to answer those questions, and I'm happy to interact with you. Lastly, I will be at EMS World Expo running their simulation lab in the exhibit hall, as I have been for the last 15 years. If you're going, stop by, say hello, tell me you saw the webinar, and bring your questions live there. Ivan Mustafa, who is also my colleague who will be there, is a very experienced simulationist, and between the two of us, we can answer most of those questions. So with that, thank you very much. We're to that point where I'm going to turn this back over to Laerdal, and they're going to move towards question and answers. But this is my contact information. Either one of the emails will work. Be happy to, as I said, speak. If you're into LinkedIn, you can connect to me on LinkedIn, and we can message on LinkedIn as well. And with that, I'm turning it over to Christine.
Thank you so much, John. Such great information. And thank you so much for sharing all your experience with us.
Oh, you're welcome.
I've seen a couple of questions come in to the chat, and I think some may have been sent directly to Helen as well. But one that did come up was asking if you have any best practices around using debriefing tools or rubrics or scoring sheets to ensure that everyone is maximizing learnings.
There are several highly respected rubrics, checklists, if you will, for debriefings. I am one of those that I don't recommend one specific one. I tend to ask educators to look at 2 or 3 of them and look at them and determine which one works for them. Most of the debriefing rubrics that are high end can be found on the Society for Simulation and Healthcare's website. in their resource area. I know that NAEMSE has a few in their simulation resource area as well. As I said, I don't necessarily use a singular one. I use one that I think works well for leadership simulations. I have another one that I think works much better for clinical. But overall, it's a use and diffuse practice. You have to kind of use them in your tests and see which one works best for you, and then pick that one. The other thing is there's nothing that says that you have to use a pre-made debriefing process. You can take an outline of the debriefing process that you can get from SSH, and you can develop your own rubric that's very specific to the scenario and very specific to the organization. And I know a lot of educators who do that themselves. It's a good question, though.
Thank you. There was also some interest in sharing a link to the template that you mentioned earlier. So if we can share that out or drop that into the chat, or just let us know where we can.
Yeah, I'll get it. I'll just need to log on in the simulation SSH and get that template. That's fine.
Okay, wonderful.
We can send it out with an email later on.
Okay. And do you have any recommendations for budgeting for leadership development?
Oh, the dreaded finance question. Okay, so this is what I tell people as they're discussing this with administration. First off, chances are it's not going to cost you a ton of money to develop these. If you already have FTOs and education personnel, they're probably using scenarios and using simulation. So they can help you move into this. So you're not really buying a lot of equipment. It's not like you have to buy a mannequin for this. Do some agencies pay the actors? Sure. But do you have to do that? No. A lot of agencies will use senior personnel. I know two agencies that border each other who swap administrative staff when they do these teachings and use the administrative staff from another organization as the actors. The biggest expense can be in the time it takes to bring people in. So that backfill of shifts, if you will, or overtime, or however you're paying that, whether you're doing it individually or whether you're holding a leadership class and you're dropping simulation in. One thing I'm really adamant about is you shouldn't just do simulations without some prep education. So I like putting these in leadership development classes and leadership development processes. And many times that stuff's already budgeted for. So it's just adding a little bit of supply money or that sort of thing. Off the top of my head, don't really have a number because it ranges depending on how many people you have, but it's generally not expensive. And it can be, again, there's not a ton of equipment that you need. You can do it in situ in somebody's office. So.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you. And Helen, thanks for coming back on with us. Are there any questions that were sent directly to you that you'd like to bring up?
Yeah, thanks, Christine. Yes, and that was fantastic, John. Thank you for going over that. So just a couple of questions. The first one is, I also got a budgeting question, so glad you answered that. I got another question about ROI, actually. So it was, you mentioned ROI. Can you elaborate on how you measure leadership growth or improvement after simulation training?
Measuring this kind of simulation can be a little bit difficult. It's measured in the way leaders react post simulations, how they deal with staff. So when you have these incidents and a leader has had education in it, the way they deal with the situation can be cleaner, and it can be less brutal on the employee. And really, that's what we want. We want the leader to be able to sit one-on-one with an employee, whether it's a disciplinary action or whether it's a discussion, and be able to function with a good, clear communication. So how well do looking at how well your leaders post this process are communicating? Are they doing better one-on-one? Are they doing better with their team interactions? Those are the physical ROIs you're going to see. The other thing that you're going to see is this connectivity between the people who do the scenarios. You're going to start seeing, hopefully, your supervisors talking to each other and talking about how to deal with situations more uniformly. And that's what you get in your return on investment on this. You're educating potential leaders or current leaders, and you're looking at how they're using that education to support the organization. Is there a checklist that says they're doing this, they're doing this, they're doing this? Not really. Could you design one? Certainly. But most of the agencies that I know of look at what are the results? How is the interaction going with the staff, the teams, and leadership above and teams below? Good question.
Excellent. Thank you. Another question I just noticed in the chat. Are you required to use rubrics if you have formative, I can't say that word right now, simulations?
Formative.
Yes.
Formative.
Struggling.
You're not required, but I personally think rubrics work really well, especially when they're designed specifically for the scenario. So I like rubrics. I encourage them. Some educators just like simple checklists. I like the rubric concept because it's easily reproducible. And, that's a big thing in education. We want to be able to reproduce equally when we do these scenarios for more than one person. So rubrics are my positive when it comes to that.
Excellent. Okay. And Christine,
I think we have time maybe for one more question. We're getting close to the top of the hour. I saw one more come in through Q&A asking, is there a typical timeline that in order to create these simulation scenarios, what is your typical timeline?
That's a really good question. On the clinical side, we say that it usually takes 3 to 6 times longer than the scenario. So if you're running a half-hour scenario, you're looking at 3 hours because you need to do research, you need to develop the situation, you need to kind of head test it and walk through it yourself. Generally, I will tell faculty who are developing scenarios, plan on at least three times. If it's an in-depth scenario and you're involving HR policies and stuff, it may take a little bit longer. But development time, spending time in the development process sharpens senios and makes scenarios clean. Should not run these offhand and just say, well, today we're just going to do this. I don't have any paperwork, I don't have anything. We're just going to do this. That's not going to work because you're not going to reach your education goals, and you're certainly not going to reach the organization's goals.
Very helpful. Great. Well, before we wrap up, we did just want to let you know that we do have a dedicated EMS resource page that has lots of quick access to some of Laerdal's product solutions and training tools and other EMS focused content all in one place. So this is one way to stay connected to the latest resources that are tailored for your teams. And if you're interested in contributing to the future of EMS education, please consider filling out the contact form. You see that was just dropped into the chat, and we can reach out to you about participation opportunities for an EMS focus group. I want to give a big thank you to John again for sharing your experience. Thank you to NAEMSE for collaborating with us, and thank you to our audience for joining us today. Take care, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you all. Appreciate you all logging on.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.